the draft contents of the updated 2023 to 2031 actually housing element. And I'm gonna briefly, I've been before the council a couple times, so this will be some of this will be very familiar to the council members and to members of the public who may be on the meeting as well. But just to provide some context and background, I'm going to briefly touch on the background of what is the housing element, an overview of its contents and components, the update process and the requirements for the update, and then I'll dig in more deeply to the sections of the updated draft housing element. This is a little bit of a long presentation, so at that point, after I go through some of the content, I will stop and take a break and ask for any questions that may have arisen at that point, and then I will turn to the topics that I think may be of most interest to the council at this point: the regional housing needs allocation and the sites inventory. I'm going to introduce a sites inventory interactive mapping tool we'll be launching next week, which will be useful for anyone who really wants to dig into the sites inventory, and then talk a little bit about next steps, how to comment on the housing element, and open it up to discussion. So again, what is the housing element? This is a plan for the housing needed in a given jurisdiction or community. It is part of the county's general plan and is a required component of the county's general plan, and it must be updated on a schedule that is established by state law, and that schedule is now every 8 years. So every jurisdiction in the county, the unincorporated county, and all the other jurisdictions, as well as the Bay Area, are updating their housing elements right now on that schedule that's established by the law. And it assesses our current housing needs, it assesses future housing needs over the next 8 years, and then it must include policies and programs to address those needs. And it must show that we have sufficient sites to meet the amount of housing that the state and the Association of Bay Area Governments inform us that we have to plan for over the next 8 years. And again, the county's housing element is the unincorporated areas only. Each city, each jurisdiction has their own housing element that deals with their own housing issues. So what are the components of the housing element? It includes an assessment of demographics, housing conditions, and housing needs. It must evaluate constraints to housing production, and those can be regulations, those could be environmental factors, they could be market costs of production, and other factors that go into making it more difficult to produce the housing that we need. It must include an assessment of the housing resources that we have available, an evaluation of the prior housing element from 2014, and again, an identification of the capacity to meet our projected housing needs, which is our sites inventory, which must show that we can meet our regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. And it must have a housing plan with goals, policies, and programs to meet those needs. And new in this cycle, we must have a fair housing assessment, which looks at segregation, discrimination, and how those play out in the accessibility and availability of housing to various communities. And we must have a plan to affirmatively further fair housing. So just touching on the update process and the timeline, we had intended to have a draft. So you can see here, we began actually before January 2021, but this begins in January 2021. We did engage in community outreach across the past year, worked on studies, worked on analysis of data, and draft components of the housing element. We hoped to have a draft for review in mid-2022. Now the plan is at the end of this month at latest, we should be releasing the draft housing element for review. And then we would go through the public hearing process, councils and commissions, and ideally have the housing element adopted by January 2023, although that will depend on how fast review happens at the state level and the extent of changes they may require of us. So key review stages upcoming. As I said, we will have an interactive map tool that we'll be launching, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but that should actually come out next week, or if not, within the next 2 weeks. Again, the draft housing element by the start of October. There's a public review period that then takes place for 30 days, and we will integrate any comments and other information that we receive through public comment, and then hearings in October and November, and submittal to HCD ideally by November. So, and just to touch on what are the sections of the housing element, I'm going to go through the content basically in this order: the conditions and the needs, the constraints, resources, review of our prior housing element, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and public outreach and input. In the actual housing element itself, those are appendices. They're at the end of the housing element. They're very detailed and analytical portions. And the actual meat of the housing element itself comes up front, and that is policies and programs and the sites inventory and the regional housing needs allocation. So I'm actually presenting it slightly in the reverse order from what it appears in the housing element itself. So first, demographics, housing conditions and needs. And I'm just going to touch on some of the main findings, some of the key elements that we have presented in the housing element. There obviously is quite a bit more information that appears in the document itself that you'll see when it comes out, but I'll just touch on some highlights here. So population, the unincorporated population has grown at the same rate as the county as a whole over the last 10 years. It represents 8% of the county's residents. And North Fair Oaks actually has grown, just as a side note, slower. It grew 2% over the last 10 years. So it has lagged somewhat behind the county in total growth. In terms of age, the county's population is aging. There was a significant increase in the age groups over 55 years old, but also the 18 to 34-year-old age group grew pretty significantly as well. The other age groups were fairly static. And that tends to show that the older population of the county is aging in place, but we've had a large influx of younger workers drawn by the tech industry, obviously. So those are the two groups that actually show the most dramatic increase. The 55-year and older growth is just the population aging naturally. The 18 to 34-year-old growth is an influx of workers. Most county housing in the unincorporated areas is single family and owner occupied, but younger residents and residents of color are much more likely to live in rental housing than are other residents. But rental housing is still a significant minority in the county's housing stock. And no surprise to anyone, I would think, for sale housing and rental housing is unaffordable to almost all income categories except the very high end. And rental housing in particular is significantly more expensive, and renters are very likely to overpay for housing. Again, rental households and households in low income categories also face significant overcrowding, with more persons per unit and per bedroom than other types of housing and other income categories. The county's farm labor population has been declining over the last decade, and has also changed from migrant workers to mostly workers who live in the county full time. And that's characteristic of agricultural production, essentially across the country. But we have seen a decline, but regardless of that decline, farm laborers still face some of the severest housing affordability challenges of anyone in the county. The county does not have sufficient housing for disabled residents. The disabled population has grown slightly, but the increase in housing production specifically for those populations has not kept pace. And the unincorporated county's homeless population has also increased pretty significantly, but it's almost exclusively in the coastside areas. In the county's point in time one-night homeless count, which took place earlier this year or last year, we did look at North Fair Oaks, and there were no homeless surveyed in North Fair Oaks, and very few in the other unincorporated pockets, but many on the coast side. And I think that's largely attributable to the fact that it's people living in cars or other similar vehicles, and it's much easier to locate those vehicles on the coast side in the relatively rural areas. So this indicates to us a need for more diversity of housing stock, including more rental stock, more multifamily housing, and units for different household sizes, including in particular larger households. Housing that is appropriate for seniors with the growing senior population, and for special needs populations such as persons with disabilities, and more homeless housing. Definitely more farm labor housing, and more affordable farm labor housing, and or assistance, direct assistance for farm laborers, and just more affordable housing of all types. Turning to constraints to housing production. The county over the last 10 years has significantly reduced constraints to housing production. So we have updated and streamlined our accessory dwelling units to make it far easier for those types of units to be created. We've updated the density bonus regulations, which allows denser housing in exchange for the provision of affordable housing. We have adopted more multifamily and higher density zoning districts to streamline the process of creating multifamily housing. We've adopted more objective standards to make it quicker to process permits, to keep the subjectivity of permitting and of review out of the process to make it quicker for permits to be issued. We've streamlined our electronic permitting systems so that we have now an entirely paperless system, which makes it much easier to actually process permits. We've streamlined our farm labor housing permitting. We now permit emergency shelters for the homeless by right in an area of the county in unincorporated Colma. And if you look at our fee levels and the processing times for development permits in the unincorporated county, ours are comparable to or better, lower fees and faster processing times than most other county jurisdictions. So we're doing fairly well on that score. It's not excessively burdensome to go through the permitting process and to pay the fees for the permitting process compared to other jurisdictions. However, obviously, there are always still opportunities for further reduction of constraints. We see the keys as identifying additional areas for more multifamily zoning, expanding the non-discretionary review and approval process. So taking even more subjectivity out of the process so that permitting decisions are a yes or no. Do you meet the standards? Do you not meet the standards? Further streamlining and consolidating the permit review and processing system. And of course, continuing to provide housing funding and other types of support for affordable and other types of housing, and identifying new resources to support housing production. So turning to the housing resources that the county has available, the county housing department is the pass-through entity for federal and state and regional and local funding. So we actually provide significant amounts of support to all the jurisdictions as well as to the unincorporated county. But just a few highlights here. The county has an affordable housing trust fund funded by Measure A, Measure K, and that provides, that's a sales tax a sales tax measure, which provides significant amounts of funding for affordable housing. We have an inclusionary housing ordinance, which requires that 20% of units in multifamily projects be created as affordable housing. We have adopted in the last housing element cycle an affordable housing impact fee for development that is otherwise not required to provide affordable housing, such as commercial development, industrial development. That type of development pays a fee, which goes into a trust fund, and that helps to support affordable housing. We've dedicated significant amounts of county land for housing production. For instance, the site behind the health clinic at Middlefield Junction, the county has dedicated that to an affordable housing project. We participate in a local housing trust fund with other jurisdictions, which supports the construction, rehabilitation, and purchase of affordable housing, and also provides mortgage assistance for lower income groups, which have a harder time accessing mortgages. And of course, we provide significant support for homeless housing and for services, and we've provided significant support as well as preservation efforts, rehabilitation efforts, and protection of tenants of mobile home parks from the conversion of their mobile home units and the mobile home parks themselves. So turning to the review of the prior housing element. So again, a lot of the constraints that were lessened or removed that I cited earlier, we identified those in our review of what was working in the prior housing element. So the increased production of accessory dwelling units was a success. We also expanded health and safety inspections in multifamily rental structures. They're now more frequent and they cover more types of structures and more units. We've developed new revenue sources for affordable housing. We've streamlined, again, the residential development approval process. We adopted a number of new regulations to protect mobile home park tenants from conversion, from displacement, and from illegal rent increases. And we've also devoted funds to mobile home rehabilitation and replacement of mobile home units. We've provided significant assistance for energy efficiency audits and upgrades, and solar installation and transfer to electric construction to support energy efficiency in both residential and commercial buildings. And we have adopted a number of new high density residential zoning districts to allow greater densities and more multifamily housing. So many of the programs that were in the prior housing element are ongoing or incomplete, and those have been carried forward and in either an expanded or amended format, or just carried forward time-wise to continue in the current housing element. Some of them were complete, and some are ineffective or unnecessary, and those programs have been removed from this housing element. So turning to the new requirement for affirmatively furthering fair housing. So affirmatively furthering fair housing means taking meaningful actions, and this is of the state's definition, in addition to taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics, be that race, be that class, be that gender, be it ethnicity, be it sexual orientation, whatever that characteristic may be. The idea is to remove the barriers to access to housing in this case, and to affordable housing that may be differential across those types of characteristics. So the housing element must include an assessment of fair housing, and it must include policies and programs to address and to further fair housing. So we actually contracted our analysis, as did a number of other jurisdictions, to a consulting firm that specializes in this type of analysis. And the findings in brief are here. There were no fair housing complaints in the unincorporated county between 2017 and 2021, which is a good outcome for us. We are not facing a lot of complaints about fair housing issues in the unincorporated county specifically, although our housing department does support fair housing issues and fair housing organizations in the incorporated areas. So we are also dealing with those as a county, but they're not specific to the unincorporated areas. Second finding, racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately impacted by poverty, low household income, overcrowding, and homelessness in the unincorporated county, and are more likely to live in lower resource areas and be denied home mortgage loans in the unincorporated county. And North Fair Oaks is one of those areas that is disproportionately impacted by fair housing issues. And over half of renters in the unincorporated county are cost burden, spending more than 30% of income for housing, and a significant number also spend more than 50%. So they're extremely cost burdened. So the updated housing element includes policies that are intended to increase housing access and decrease segregation, address affordability challenges, particularly rental costs, but also mortgage support for lower income communities, support fair housing enforcement and education through technical assistance, through funding, through support to nonprofits and to legal organizations that do this type of work, and to affirmatively market county supported affordable housing to underrepresented communities. And so still incomplete, we are assessing the sites inventory, which is the identification of all the sites that are available for housing production over the next 8 years, against fair housing characteristics, in order to determine, does the sites inventory, the sites we've identified, and the types of development that can happen on those sites, are they increasing segregation? Are they decreasing segregation? Do they further access to resources and opportunities, or do they would they take lower income populations further from access to opportunities, and do they concentrate areas of high poverty? So that isn't an assessment we are undertaking right now. That is essentially the last component of the housing element that is not complete. And when we have that, the draft will be ready to release, and you'll see that in the draft housing element that is distributed. And just touching on outreach input very briefly, I went over this pretty extensively at the last presentation, but just in brief, we have taken part in presentations, forums, and workshops at the North Fair Oaks Community Council on multiple occasions, the Mid-Coast Community Council, Sustainable Pescadero. We have taken part in multiple countywide forums on the housing element update, multiple stakeholder forums as well. We distributed a housing element survey on housing issues, and we have had a website comment form open, and we've been collecting comments through that and aggregating those as well. And all of those, the feedback received, the comment received, and the input at all of those forums through all of those means will inform and has informed what is in the housing element, but will continue to inform as we go through into a formal comment period. And we will be amending the housing element comment to respond to the comments we've received. So, and just what we've been hearing so far, just some of the highlights. Housing costs are a universal concern. Almost every commenter recognizes that housing costs are incredibly burdensome, and everyone is experiencing the impacts of them. Most commenters also identify housing supply shortages as a concern, but there are very different ideas about how to address those shortages, as you can imagine. There is a recognized need for more diversity of housing stock with different building types, different unit types, and rental and ownership housing. Commenters note that housing pressures are making it hard for workers to live in their communities. Housing costs are obviously driving gentrification and displacement, which is a concern that many commentators have expressed. And there's also the concern that new development, and in particular state development mandates, are negatively impacting community conditions in ways that we may not have planned for and may not be prepared for. We've also heard that the development and permitting process is too slow and too costly. Despite the changes that we've made over the last decade, there's still a perception that it is not only too slow, too costly, but also somewhat opaque. So we will continue to try to address those challenges. There's concern that transportation, climate change, access to opportunity, and all housing issues are housing issues, and they should all be addressed together as interlinked concerns. There is an expressed concern that the county housing element should explicitly consider equity and fair housing, and through the analysis of affirmatively furthering fair housing, we are doing so. The county should provide more resources for farm labor housing, which is a trenchant point. We are trying to do that as well. And then just a broad point, there's an expressed interest in better information on housing issues generally, on housing policies, and just on direct availability. Where is housing available? Where's affordable housing available? So with that, I'm going to take a brief break, if there are any questions that have come up just through the initial portion of the presentation, I'd be happy to take them now. Seeing none.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
I do.
Oh, okay, Beatrice, I see you.
Right. There was a part that said let me see. Oh, ineffective and the unnecessary were just kind of like a little bit. How is it? How or who makes that decision when it's unnecessary or ineffective?
Well, so what we get, this is about the So what we did is we looked back at the housing policies and programs that we had adopted in the prior housing element, and we looked at what were the outcomes of them, and we also looked at the drivers of them. So why did we adopt those policies and programs? Okay. Are the conditions still the same now, or are those conditions met and we don't need them anymore? Or were the programs we tried to put in place not working and not meeting the concern that they were intended to address, and therefore maybe we should find a different way to address that? So essentially it was just an assessment of how they are succeeding, whether they've succeeded or not.
Okay, all righty.
Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead, Will, and finish your presentation, because I suspect some of the data that you're going to present now may reflect back on earlier parts of the presentation. I'd like to give the public an opportunity to see all the information, and then we can discuss as a council.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
All right, so turning to housing element goals, policies, and programs. So this, along with our ability to meet our regional housing needs allocation, is what is called the housing plan. And the housing plan is organized in the following goals: protect existing affordable housing stock, support new housing for extremely low to moderate income households, so everything below the above moderate category, which needs our help the least. Promote sustainable communities through regional coordination efforts, locating housing near employment, transportation, and services. Promote equal housing opportunities. Promote equity through housing policy and through housing investments. and require or encourage energy efficiency, resource conservation, and climate resiliency design in new and existing housing. So these are the organizing principles for the housing plan, and the policies and programs all fall under one of these organizing principles. So I'm just going to touch on some of the what we feel are most important of the policies and programs that go into the housing plan. There are something like 40 of them at this point, so I'm not going to go through all of them. You will see them. I did provide the council with an executive summary that covers more of them, but you will see them all when the draft housing element is released. So we intend to continue and to increase funding for the rehabilitation of low-income housing and for home repair programs and for lead mitigation and retrofitting of existing housing to make it safer, more secure, and more livable. We intend to preserve affordable housing stock that is at risk from conversion to market rate. So that includes both subsidized housing where the subsidies are ending and the owners may intend to convert it, or naturally affordable housing that may be facing rent raises or price raises. Funding affordable housing production, providing rent subsidies for low-income households and mortgage support for low-income households, particularly for large family households and extremely low-income housing. Continuing to protect mobile home tenants by regulating rents and regulating mobile home park conversions, helping rehabilitate mobile home park units and parks. And also not stated here, but we are looking for resources to help mobile home tenants and or nonprofits buy mobile home parks to sustain them long-term, either as a resident ownership cooperative or as a nonprofit that will operate them in perpetuity. And again, continue to amend zoning for higher density multifamily housing near transit. That includes the small ongoing Northbrook zoning amendments that we will be updating you on next week. Further refining the list of county-owned properties and making them available for affordable housing. We have properties owned by the county that are not in use, similar to the Middlefield Junction site, which was unutilized. And we are attempting to better identify which of them are not needed for any use by the county and which of them might be appropriate for affordable housing so that we can offer them to developers as part of an affordable housing production package. We intend to increase the accessibility of housing for the disabled by encouraging developers to use universal design features that will meet any type of resident, including those with disabilities, and to adopt what's called a formal reasonable accommodation policy, which says if our zoning regulations or other standards preclude the creation of accessibility elements, we just waive those standards so that the units can be built with accessibility. We intend to support additional development of housing for farm laborers and to continue to implement our various accessory dwelling unit programs, including we have a permit streamlining program for ADUs where they are fast-tracked now. We have a second unit center, which provides a bunch of technical assistance for ADUs, a one-stop shop, which provides a coordinated hands-on assistance for applicants, homeowners that are attempting to create ADUs. And we are working with some other jurisdictions and organizations to create pre-approved ADU designs that applicants can use so that they don't have to come up with their own designs or pay an architect. And then further, we intend to continue to reduce or waive fees for affordable housing, senior housing, and special needs housing, and to clarify and approve our fee waiver process so that it's easier to navigate and easier for applicants and for developers to understand what types of waivers are available for them. We will continue to fund enforcement of fair housing laws and education, technical assistance, and resources for agencies that help with fair housing. And again, we intend to continue supporting energy conservation, solar installation, the conversion to electric appliances, and other energy efficiency measures, not only in new housing, but in housing that is substantially retrofitted. So that's just a brief overview, the highlights of some of the more important programs. There are many, many other programs, so I won't cover them here, but you'll be seeing them very soon. So turning to the sites inventory, which is one of the key components along with the programs of the housing element. So the sites inventory is an inventory of all developable and redevelopable properties that are available for housing production over the next 8 years, sufficient to meet the county's regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. And it can also include credit for units that are in the development pipeline that may have been approved, they may be entitled, or they may be significantly along the development process but have not been built yet. And it can include projected development of ADUs and of other units, specifically SB 9 units. So the regional housing needs allocation is the amount of housing needed in the county over the next 8 years, determined by the state and by the Association of Bay Area Governments. The state determines the region's share, and then ABAG allocates that share among all the jurisdictions. And our share of that is the county's RHNA. So the housing element must identify enough developable sites and or pipeline production and projected units, ADUs and other units to meet the RHNA. If we do not, we have to take affirmative measures to increase our capacity, which generally means rezoning. So this is, and it's broken down by income level as well. So we have to show that the sites are appropriate for the types of income levels that are in the RHNA. You can see here our RHNA 5 allocation was the 2014 to 2022 allocation. We had 913 total units. And the RHNA 6 allocation, which is our current allocation for 2023 to 2021, is about 3 times that, 2,833. And you can see the largest tranche is the very low income, and then above moderate income, and the low and moderate income categories are roughly equal. So it's a pretty significant increase, and it's a challenge, obviously, for us to meet. It's a challenge for all of the jurisdictions to meet. So this is what we have to demonstrate through the sites inventory, that we have a capacity to produce. So the sites inventory assesses the sites available for production. It includes vacant sites, but it also can include potential sites for redevelopment, sites that have a use on it already, but are likely or possible to redevelop as housing or as mixed use with housing. We can credit projects that are approved, entitled, or underway, but not yet built. We can credit projections, again, of ADUs and other anticipated non-site specific productions. So trends based on production overall, but not based on an examination of each individual site. We must show that the sites are feasibly developable. And again, we must, if we cannot meet the RHNA, commit to creating more sites. So in our sites inventory, we have the following categories. We projected ADU production based on the past several years of production countywide in the unincorporated areas. We also projected SB 9 production, and SB 9 again is the new state law that says for single family zoned parcels, developed or undeveloped, it makes it much easier both to subdivide them and to build multiple units, up to 4 in some cases, on a formerly single family site. It also lowers the size that sites can be and streamlines the process significantly. So we looked at SB 9 production based on what has happened since the law took effect in January 2022, what we have got in terms of permits so far, and projected that forward. Then we included the pipeline projects that are underway but not yet approved. And then we looked at the core of the sites inventory, which is the vacant and non-vacant sites that are suitable for development or redevelopment. So turning to ADU production, this is all of our ADU production, which means units actually completed in the county in the unincorporated areas since 2012. And as you can see, it was fairly low back in 2012, a very modest increase across the years until 2017. In 2018 is when we first amended our ADU regulations to comply with state law and to make it easier to build. And then we revised them again in 2019 and again in 2020. And as you can see, the numbers increased significantly. In 2021, there were 43 units built, and we are on par, on pace to have something like that or more this year. So projecting that forward, this is our, I think, fairly conservative estimation of how many ADUs will be built over the next 8-year period. We start with 35 next year and hold that static for a couple of years. And then we have a gradual increase over the next few years. And we believe that as more homeowners become aware of how easy it is now to produce ADUs, as they become more popularized, as the county's programs, the publicity and the technical assistance that we're providing take hold, we will continue to see an increase. I think this is a significant undercount, but we're being conservative. We don't want to project too aggressively because of development uncertainty. So in essence, it ends up at about an average of 45 per year over the next 8 years for 355 total units. For SB 9, we have received something on the order of 12 applications as of a month or two ago, and those would have created about 18 units once processed. And that's just since the beginning of the year when this law took effect. However, we don't assume all of those applications will make it through the pipeline or all those units will be built. So this is again a conservative estimate. We think we'll see at least 10 applications netting 12 new units in 2023, and then there again is a gradual increase. So in total, over the next 8 years, 122 applications and 176 units. Again, I think this is actually very conservative and unrealistically so, but we don't want to make assumptions that are overly aggressive just because it's very hard to project what may happen. So we think this is at least a realistic assessment. Then we turn to the pipeline projects. You can see here, there are a number of them in North Fair Oaks, and the income categories are based on the actual projection, the actual proposed income categories in the projects themselves. And so we have in total 739 units in the development pipeline now. Of those, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are in North Fair Oaks. So it's a significant number. And there are quite a few of those that are 100% affordable or significantly affordable. So there are quite a few lower income units in the pipeline from the projects that are already ongoing. And then the vacant and non-vacant sites, we look at 3 categories: vacant single family sites, which can be built with just a unit, disregarding SB 9, disregarding ADUs. We make no assumptions on a site-specific basis regarding those units. And we assume that all of the vacant single family sites we identified are going to be affordable only to above moderate income categories. That might not necessarily be true. They might be saleable to moderate income or lower in some cases, but the vast majority of them will be market rate, and those are affordable to above moderate income. We then look at vacant multifamily sites, and vacant multifamily sites, there are a couple of ways to project the affordability. If they are designated as affordable housing sites, then we base it on what that designation requires. In other cases, if multifamily sites are zoned at 30 units or per acre or more, the state says that those are appropriate for very low and low income categories. So we've allocated those appropriately. And then non-vacant redevelopable sites that are assumed to be redeveloped, those are also appropriate for lower income categories if they are zoned at densities above 30 units an acre. If in either of those categories, if they were not zoned at 30 units an acre or more, we assumed they were either above moderate or moderate income, and they would be developed as such. So when you look at the totals of all of those categories, we have the income categories here. We have the vacant single family, vacant multifamily, and non-vacant multifamily residential. And you can see all of the vacant single family, 676 of them. Each of those is a single site. Those are all the sites we have, and we're assuming 1 unit on each of them, and all in the above moderate category. For vacant multifamily residential, we have 250 total units broken out across these categories. And you can see also the total sites at the bottom. There are 19 vacant multifamily sites, 250 units. And then for non-vacant sites that are redevelopable, there are 69 total sites for 1,384 units. Most of those are still above moderate, but a significant number of lower income units as well. So then you can look at how all those categories add up. Here are the income categories on the left. Here's our regional housing needs allocation in the second column. And again, 208,033 units in total. Vacant single family, vacant multifamily, non-vacant multifamily residential, the pipeline credits that are underway. ADUs, we allocate the affordability of ADUs based on a methodology that the Association of Bay Area Governments and the University of California, Berkeley came up with by looking at the actual market rentals and sale prices of ADUs. So this is based on real market data. So they're split across all categories, but they tend to be below the above moderate income. And then for SB 9 units, We allocated half of them to the moderate income category and half to the above moderate, which is essentially what we are seeing on the market as well. Most of them are just in the higher income categories as it happens, but not all of them are above moderate. In total units, this column shows how all those categories stack up, and you can see we meet our regional housing needs allocation for every category. We significantly meet it for the above moderate income category. We meet it a bit for the moderate, we beat it a bit for the low income, and we are just barely scraping by in the very low income category. So that is the sites inventory in total from all of the sources of analysis and projection that are included in the housing element. So with that, I'll leave the sites inventory numbers briefly, but we can come back and dig a little bit more into that. But I just wanted to flag, we are going to have ideally next week, and I think it's on track to be next week, an interactive mapping tool, which allows you to look at each of the types of sites inventory parcels that are included in the analysis. You can look at it by county area. You can also see the zoning and the general plan land use designation. So you can zoom in at any level of detail that you would like to see. And it allows the exploration of all the sites identified. It shows the site location. It shows the type of the site. Is it a multifamily site? Is it vacant, non-vacant? Is it a pipeline project? It shows the size. It shows the allowed densities. And it shows the presumed income levels of the units that are attributed to that site. And you can also just click. So you can click on a particular site and you get all the data. Here's the APN. Here's the address. Here is what it is zoned for, the minimum and maximum densities, et cetera. What's the current use? All of that data is in there. And that will be live. We will send a link out to the council and we will send a link out broadly to the public as well. And we'd appreciate it if the council has a mailing list, if you could distribute it forward as well, because I think people will be very interested to be able to dig into this and see it on a site-by-site basis and look at it. And also then they can comment on particular sites and tell us how they feel the assessment is, whether the assessment is reasonable or unreasonable, and why. So with that, we have obviously the Housing Element Update website. People can still sign up for our mailing list at the website here. The Sites Inventory Explorer will be posted on the website. The draft housing element will be also on the website once it's released. And we, again, hope that's in the next 2 or 3 weeks. There's a comment form on the website. People can still comment. It is open. And an overview of the comments we received on a running basis is appearing on the website as well. And that link is there. And my contact information, again, at the county. And if you have a Spanish language question, you can go directly to Brian Albini at this website, at this email, excuse me. With that, that covers what I have to present at this point, and I'd be happy to open it up for any questions and discussion that may take place.
Okay, at this point, let's open it up to public comment. Diana, if you could tell me if any members of the public have a comment on this, and keep in mind individuals in the public who do have a comment that you're limited to 2 minutes.
During this time, members of the public, if you wish to comment on agenda item number 3, housing element update, please use the raise hand feature. When you hear your name called, we'll send you a request to mute your mic, and each person will be given 2 minutes to speak. I do not see any hands raised. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Then with that, let's open it up for questions from council members. Do any council members have questions of Will? I see Everardo's hand up. Councilmember Rodriguez, please go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Will, for your presentation. I think that from a general perspective, the ideas proposed in the housing element look good. However, increasing density in North Fair Oaks, as is being suggested, I think it puts North Fair Oaks at a huge disadvantage arguably because its proximity to transportation. I'd like to point out that the Atherton Caltrain station was closed permanently. And so for me as a resident of North Fair Oaks, it's no longer that easy to, walk all the way over to the Redwood City Caltrain station. There are buses that run, along Middlefield Road and El Camino Real. However, the reality of public transportation via bus is a very different one. So, all these to come down to the conclusion that that traffic and particularly parking continues to be an exacerbated issue in North Fair Oaks. And that I think that increasing development, particularly housing, without considering the other factors that make a community livable, it's just going to bring more imbalance to what we already have. I was just at a meeting for the grading permit, a presentation for the 7-story building on Edison Way at 2nd. And there was a lot of public comment, and most of it was around parking problems, traffic worries, insufficient public transportation, and also the how generous county was, in providing a minimum requirement of parking space for that development. So, in addition to that, I don't see any plans for green areas, public spaces, parklets, which North Fair Oaks has none, literally. And so that is one of the worries, that increasing density only because it is somewhat, because North Fair Oaks is somewhat closely convenient to transportation, is going to be very difficult, and I'm very worried about the sustainability of such heavy and disproportionate development in North Fair Oaks. Again, because this would only exacerbate the situation and be detrimental to the quality of life that we already have.
Should I respond, Brooks?
Please do. Please do. Go ahead, Will.
No, Councilmember Rodriguez, I absolutely understand the concern. I think, it's something that we are struggling with where, the housing is needed. We do want to put it near transit. The state obviously wants us to put it near transit. We are not proposing significantly more density in terms of the rezoning that's ongoing, and we're not proposing any rezonings beyond that. It's a very small extension of the zoning that exists, but given the densities already allowed, North Fair Oaks is a place where obviously you're already seeing significant amounts of development. The closure of the Atherton station was really unfortunate. We are trying to work. So one of the policies in the housing element is to continue to work on a study of how to put in another rail crossing that is further to the north. So it makes it easier to access the other side of Caltrain and to get to Redwood City more easily. So that is one way to address some of the access challenges, but we understand the balance of the parking and the traffic issues and also the green space. We also will be coming back with a 10-year review of the North Fair Oaks community plan and whether and how the policies of the plan have been achieved and which of them which of them should still be pursued and which of them need to be improved. And green space is a large portion of that. So we will at least be trying to look comprehensively at that. But I think you've identified the kind of challenge of balancing the needs and the impacts of development.
Do you have further questions, Ever? Are there questions from other council members? Oh,
So, sorry, one more question. So
please go ahead.
What would be the next steps on the planification process?
In the review of the community plan, or so we are in the process of hiring a contractor, and they will be coming out to the community, and also they will be doing an analysis of the community plan and the policies and what has been achieved. And the community plan specifically has a number of policies aimed at increasing the green space, the open space, and the park area in North Fair Oaks. And I think, we would all acknowledge that probably the only improvement that's happened is Friendship Park since the plan was adopted, and that's a very small amount of new space, so not sufficient at all. So that will definitely be one of the things that we'll be looking to address as we go forward.
Thank you.
It is my plan, by the way, Ever, to have that contractor speak at an upcoming NFOCC meeting just as soon as the contract is signed. I don't know if you have insight into that, Will, as far as where we are in that process.
I do not know.
Okay.
I think possibly the Deputy County Executive Officer might have a little more insight, actually, Justin.
Justin, do you know where we are on that, or?
Not to put you on the spot, Justin.
No problem. Yes, I believe it's going to be brought at an upcoming Board of Supervisors meeting, the contract for that vendor. And then Chair Esser, maybe we can talk about the best way to keep the NFOCC apprised. I'm sure that the part of the engagement will be coming to the North Fair Oaks Community Council to report on the plan and also to get feedback from community members. Perhaps initially, a staff report might help initially just to lay out a timeline and manage everyone's expectations. We can certainly connect and that we fully expect that contractor to engage with NFOCC and with many other engagement opportunities with the community.
Yeah, a kickoff meeting would be terrific, if only to explain to both the council and the community kind of the scope of work and how the contractor will interact with both the council and the community. So as soon as that contract is signed, we can agendize that, perhaps perhaps as early as January, something like that, or November if the contract is signed, although that may be rushing it a bit.
Yeah, why don't I reach out to you after that? I or someone in planning building will reach out to you after the contract's inked.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Do we have other questions from council members? Or Will? I've got a few. Will, our arena goals, those can be met with either rental or owner occupied units for sale. Is that correct?
It's the affordability that really matters. It doesn't matter what type of tenure it is, whether it's rental or whether it's owner. So as long as we have enough units in the income categories, the arena does not specify whether,
Okay. It's income driven.
It's income based.
Saying. Got it.
We realize that we need more rental units because we have a disproportionate amount of ownership units, and those meet a particular need, but the arena doesn't speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to offer something on parking because I actually attended one of those grading sessions for another project a couple of months ago. And I looked at the proposal that was being built. I don't remember the address off the top of my head, but as with our arena goals, the state has a lot of input in terms of the amount of parking that's required given the type of building that you're building. For example, the project that I saw was low-income housing targeted at seniors. I think they were talking something like 80 units or something like that. The parking requirement was for 38 parking spaces on site, so maybe one parking space per 2 units. And when I looked at the drawings that were being presented, those parking units could actually be stacked. So in other words, one car stacked on top of another. So it's not through lack of effort on the part of the county that we're in this fix. The state, as with our arena goals, has an awful lot to say about that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that further,
Yeah, I think
Will, but I
that's-
was surprised, needless to say, when I saw that.
I think, I mean, you've identified something that all the jurisdictions are just having to get a handle on, is that you're talking about I think it's an 86 unit senior affordable.
Yeah.
If you provide a fairly small portion, 10% of the units as affordable, you get an automatic parking exception that the state mandates we give to a project. If you have an all affordable, you get a larger one. If you're all senior, you get a larger one, and we have no say in that whatsoever. So whatever you may think of that as a kind of incentive program, unfortunately, that one is out of our hands. You're absolutely right.
Okay. I was looking at the numbers earlier today, and I was really pleased to see that our pipeline projects have a greater percentage of very low income units than specified by our RHNA goals. In fact, 41% of the units in our pipeline right now are very low income, while our overall RHNA goal is only 29%, which is great. Now, with that said, 46% of our very low income RHNA goal is attributed to non-vacant multifamily units. And we basically need all of those to come to our fruition if we're going to get to our very low income goal. I think we're only over that goal by 23 units or something like that. I see you've got the non-vacant multifamily residential identified on the map. At this point, two questions. First of all, you're confident that those are redevelopable, and kind of a corollary to that is how much of that is dependent upon the rezoning project that's going on right now?
So we're confident. So we're not using all of. So we're basically the non-vacant redevelopable sites that were that are around half an acre or larger, we assumed, and are zoned for more than 30 units an acre, which in North Fair Oaks is all of them. We assumed those were appropriate for very low and low income. Smaller parcels, we don't assume those are redeveloped at anything but an above moderate or a moderate, because it's harder to build. It's less likely that you get the kind of densities you need to make affordable housing supportable on those sites. None of them are contingent on the rezoning. The RHNA does not take the rezoning is a program that we put in the housing element to say continue the rezoning that's already ongoing in order to create more housing near transit and to facilitate development on the parcels that have already been rezoned. We don't rely on that in the RHNA at all. So however the rezoning comes out, it won't affect the RHNA. But you are absolutely right that we really need all of those parcels to develop, the half acre and larger parcels to develop, both in North Fair Oaks and elsewhere, because we are so close to the RHNA. So we are going to be looking, regardless of what the RHNA says, we're going to be looking at other areas of the county, particularly unincorporated Colma, to rezone for higher densities for areas that are either low density residential or maybe commercial right now. Because obviously, I mean, whatever said is true. We can't put everything in North Fair Oaks. We need to find other areas, and the margin is so slim that we need to find other areas so that there's a buffer if those units aren't constructed.
Understand. I want to give other council members a moment here. I'm rifling off questions. Are there any other questions from any other council members right now? Please just raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, I think I've got a couple more. According to the calendar, then, will you need an additional presentation to the council prior to the submittal of the housing element, or are we good on that?
We're good on that.
Okay.
We don't, yeah. And in fact, we're going to go to the Planning Commission. We will probably reach out to some of the other community councils, although they have been less eager to have hearings on the housing element than you have so far. But we will try. But the board, we'll have a board hearing, but the board doesn't even need to adopt it before we submit it. What we are going to recommend to the Board of Supervisors is direct us to submit it, because we know HCD will change it. They are going to require us. They required every jurisdiction to change it. They're going to require us to change it. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to adopt it and then have to amend it and re-adopt it. So we'll wait for their comments, their edits, and then go to the board. So the board will have seen it. They will have had a chance to comment on it, to dig into it themselves. But then ideally they would just direct us to submit it, come back with the changes and have a final version. So
Okay.
that would be the process at this point. So we don't require another hearing in the North Forks Community Council, but if you wanted one, we could certainly provide it.
I think we'll be fine on that. I just needed to know if that was a necessary step prior to
Not-
submittal
not
or
necessary.
something like that.
No,
Okay.
not at this point.
You touched on other communities and their submittals to the now I'm forgetting the acronym, the state agency that we submit these things to.
Yeah.
I've looked at the responses, particularly the one that Redwood City received, and the changes that were suggested were substantial. A couple of questions. First of all, is the January 23 date a hard deadline? We have to have an approved, state approved housing element by then?
We have a 120-day grace period
Okay.
after that before we are technically out of compliance. And
Okay.
even if we were technically out of compliance, the penalties for that don't really start to, I would say there's likely some flexibility even with that 120 days, but we definitely have a 3-month grace period formally in the law.
Yeah, that's good to know. I just read the note from the state back to Redwood City today, and each couple of sentences in there to me read like an awful lot of work for a revision. So it's good to know that we do indeed have time to make our changes after we submit. I don't have any other questions. Do any other council members have questions?
No questions through the chair, but just a comment. Also, bringing it up from that previous meeting I was attending for the grading on that 7-story building. So there were also positive comments about the looks of the building and how it would enhance the current location where, literally there's nothing right now. It's just a parking lot full of old trucks and whatnot. And so most of the community members were praising, the looks of the building and thinking that it would beautify the area, probably make it look safer, nicer, to walk around, etc. And so I'd like to voice that that opinion as well, because it's not that residents may be opposed to building more housing. I think it is the imbalance of bringing in more housing without providing something in exchange to the community that barely has any trees. Sidewalks are in pretty bad shape, that sort of thing. I think urban areas, they're livable because, there are high rises and high-rise buildings, etc. But there's also other amenities that make that city or community livable. And I think that's what the community members are alluding to, when they comment about, the fact that they're not opposing building more housing, but they're opposed to having the parking problems and traffic problems exacerbated, by that construction. So I just wanted to do that.
Thank you, Councilmember Rodriguez. I do actually have one more for you, Will. As I look at this map, I see an awful lot of the non-vacant multifamily residential construction is going to occur on Middlefield Road. And I guess I'm wondering how much of that may displace locally owned businesses that are there now. And perhaps I can do the deep dive into this when the interactive map is available. Do you kind of have a sense of, if you could characterize what's in those buildings right now, particularly the ones right along Middlefield?
So the ones we looked at and we thought were actually redevelopable tend to be, there were some that there were the the auto kind of detailing, auto shops. Some of them were warehouse uses. They were the ones that tend to be lower intensity uses and not the restaurants and not the locally serving businesses that were along the street. I think those were mostly eliminated. Off the top of my head, I can't speak to exactly which ones because there are so many parcels I can't remember which, and you will absolutely see that when you look at the Sites Explorer. But I think those are mostly the lower intensity ones that are not directly serving the street, that are not kind of serving the customers that are coming in and the local community members that are coming in off the street. But there are a few in the site's inventory that are parking lots. I think those are actually on El Camino Real, not on Middlefield. And there are a few that are just open storage lots that are, not being very intensively used at all. But yeah, it's true. If those were to redevelop, they would displace some local businesses in some of those cases, for sure. Although on the other hand, some of those parcels that you see there have owners who have approached us with the interest of developing as well. So they don't seem to be particularly concerned about displacement, but more about what is the more profitable use of their land, which I guess is understandable.
Yeah, no, that's not surprising you should say that, but I do have a concern that perhaps some people that live and work in the community may be losing their employment as a result of redevelopment. And that's something that I'd like you to consider. And is the proposal, when we look at those, are you thinking mostly mixed use, or would it be mostly pure residential? Perhaps commercial on the ground floor and residential on floors 2 and 3?
Along Middlefield and El Camino Real, we assume that a significant number of them would be mixed use.
Okay.
That's what's allowed right now. That's the easiest thing to build. And again, I would just say these are our assumptions about the likely redevelopment, but the county is not going to do anything to cause this to happen. It is the market that, and we are not rezoning these parcels. So, but you are right that if, there is the potential for redevelopment, it is a concern.
Okay. That is all I have. I'll ask one more time if there are any questions from other council members. Okay, with that, thank you very much, Will. I think we've all learned a lot on this. I'm really impressed with the progress that's been made, particularly in the last couple of months in terms of really putting a solid plan together, something we can look at and really appreciate what it's going to take to meet our goals over the next 8 years. So, good luck with in the next few months dealing with the submission, the revisions, and the state and everything that's involved in that. But this is really super work.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is all we have on our agenda for this evening. Again, thanks very much to Will for his presentation tonight, to the members of the public who attended. As always, thanks to our county staff. I think we have Emma and Kenny, Diana, Justin, and Tim for their support. Our next meeting will be a regular session next Thursday, September 22nd. Very full agenda. We're welcoming some new members to the NFOCC. We've got a planning and building item on there and a couple of other agenda items. So very full agenda for next week's session. With that, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this evening.
Thank you.